Welcome, everybody. I'll go slow here on the introductions to give people a few minutes. I know we had quite a lot of people sign up at the last minute. So a little bit about me. I'm Brian Haydin. If you don't know me, I'm a solution architect here at Concurrency. We're a Microsoft-focused systems integrator based out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, pretty much right in the heart of the Midwest. Around me personally, I also am a co-organizer of the local global AI community. And so doing, webinars, getting out and speaking and sharing, things is something that I really enjoy doing. And so today we're going to talk about a part of AI agents that, a lot of people haven't really been talking about until recently. And I've been doing this talk. This is maybe the sixth or seventh time that I've actually done this talk, first in a webinar format, maybe the only one in a webinar. But a lot of people are really starting to talk about this. And this is where you actually have to take the pilot and run these things in production and make sure that things aren't breaking. I just want to be clear that everything that I'm going to talk about today is from real project work that we've been doing here at Concurrency. The stories that I'm going to talk about are things that we've actually had to work through and built the scars and the patterns in order to, to have this really hold up when the demo guides aren't really smiling at you. So there's QR code on the screen. If you want to follow me on LinkedIn, I do a pretty regular newsletter and post some of my thoughts. And then if you're, well, it just doesn't really matter where you are, but I'll be doing this talk, around the country. I've done it in Orlando, down in Chicago. I'm going to be doing a talk in Chattanooga later this spring, but follow me on LinkedIn. Maybe I'll be in a spot near you. So getting into the weeds, how many people, I'm not going to do a poll yet. I do have a poll, but just sort of mentally think how many of you have actually deployed stuff on a Friday afternoon? And I used to think to myself, why would people want to do that? And, this story is going to be about a Friday, that probably is going to resonate with the most of you. But there are some reasons why people want to do this. First off, if I'm running a website, my e-commerce shows the traffic doesn't, really hit on Friday night. People are out doing dinners and fun things. That might be a reason why you want to do it. But it's not really enjoyable for people like me who have to be, in the war room triaging these things. So we had this support triage agent that was routing customer service tickets, real simple, kind of route this agent, route the tickets to the right team. And, everything was working pretty much just the way I'd expected. And one Friday, 4:37, we pushed what we thought was just some minor improvements, right? A small tweak to the prompt, changed the model. It said something a little bit newer. And all we were doing was just trying to improve the ticket classification. And at first, everything looked like it was going great. It was faster. The answers were more confident. The routing seemed to be pretty clear. But a little after 5, we kind of saw the first little subtle clues that things weren't running correctly. A misroute here, misroute there, and a billing ticket that landed in the support queue instead of where it was supposed to go, but not enough for us to hit a pause button or really get too concerned. But by 5:20, 15 minutes later, things started to really aggregate, right? You start to see that clustering logic that something isn't right. The grouping of unrelated tickets together just because they had some keywords that were there. Obviously, we're seeing something behaviorally that was wrong. And by 5:30-ish, we had switched the whole thing off to a human review mode, and we stopped all the automatic routing. Here's the kicker, though. The infrastructure was showing everything was green. If you were sitting in the back room saying, how's everything working? You'd look at your screen. The logs were clean. The error rates were normal. The agent was just confidently wrong, right? And so we weren't able to really catch it until the customer started noticing and the customer started making the complaints. And honestly, this is what makes agents different. So this isn't really hypothetical things anymore. What we're seeing is, more public examples of the frontier labs treating capability and deployment risk as two separate problems. Anthropic recently announced a gated release for the Mythos, story for a broader public release. But they said that it's the most capable model yet, but it was being made available only as a gated research preview for people that were working on critical defender issues. Why? Because it was getting out. And so even people building the frontier models are telling us the capability is accelerating faster than our comfort level is with these uncontrolled agent deployments. So the patterns that we're going to be talking about today are really about how you keep a promising agent from becoming an expensive incident that you have to go back to your leadership with. So I got a quick little poll here. I want to get like a pulse from the room. How many of you have read about agents? How many of you have actually built an agent? How many of you have actually shipped an agent? And how many of you you're kind of like the users and gone through it? This will help me kind of like ground maybe some of the conversations. So I'm seeing a little bit of shift here. We've got some responses. People have built some agents. That's awesome. I'm really happy to see that. But honestly, this isn't really too much of a surprise to me. Most people right now are working in the space that you guys are. I've either read a little bit about agents, I started experimenting with them, I've maybe built it, but I haven't really gotten to a point where I've shipped it or don't even see a single response for paging it. Usually you see some. But hey, at the end of the day, what the data shows that we're in this real awkward kind of teenage phase of agent adoption right now. Everybody's been excited. The demos have been going really incredibly well, and the pilots are really starting to show promise. And then about half of those projects just quietly stall out someplace between a POC and the production. And if you're looking for the answer why, if you ask enterprise teams what's keeping them up at night, about 51% of them are going to tell you that it's managing and monitoring these things at the scale. They don't just trust them yet, and honestly, they're probably right. Gartner thinks that more than 40% of agentic AI products are going to get canceled by 2027. And at the same time, they're predicting around 33% of enterprise software is going to include agentic AI by 2028. And both of those statistics, they can be true if the projects that survive are the ones that figure out how to run safely in production. And here's the number that's on this list that should get your attention. 11% of organizations, they have actual agentic AI running in production right now. Not experimenting, not piloting, just actually running. And so the message here is that you're not really behind. It's not like 100% of companies, 90%, 80% of companies have already figured this out. It's not too late for you to start thinking about doing this the right way so that you're not one of those statistics of 40% of those agent projects being canceled, by the end of next year. Let's talk about the problem, though. The problem isn't that teams are lacking ambition. The problem is that they don't trust these things to behave consistently. Let's look at this funnel for a second. I started with a POC, and the POC went great. And I graduated it up over to the pilot, and the pilot shows that it's delivering value. And then I hit this wall that I've started to characterize as a trust gap. I want to understand the three questions that are killing the momentum at this point. Is it going to behave consistently? Unlike traditional software, correct is often a little bit squishier when you start talking about agents. The same prompt might produce a different answer, and all of it is looking plausible. Another question is, what happens when you change something? If I swap in a new model, maybe I'm tweaking a prompt. Now with tools usage, I start to add a tool. Suddenly the agent might start behaving a little bit differently. And when I go back to talk to my team about it, people are just shrugging their shoulders and saying, I can't explain why it's happening. And that leads me to the last part, which is drift. And drift is a little harder for people to understand because at the end of the day, what it means is that the final answer is looking correct, but the path that it took to get to that answer was complete nonsense. And unless you can answer all three of these questions with something better than I guess, or we'll keep an eye on it, it's going to cause this trust gap that I've been talking about. Human oversight is where we kind of live in that trust gap. And it's not really a failure state, but what it is, what it's turning into is it's an expensive operating model when you have to have people still continue to touch this stuff. And so AgentOps is kind of what we've come up with to help close some of that gap. So why can't we just test our way out of this? Traditional software, we use things like unit tests, and that fails pretty much like a machine would. It's deterministic, it's repeatable. I don't know if anybody is an old C or C++ coder like me, but you look at a null pointer, you find a null pointer, you fix the null pointer, you move on, right? Pretty easy to solve for problems like that. But agents, they fail a little bit more confidently like a junior employee would. They're fast, they're eager, and they're just wrong enough to make expensive mistakes. So what does this look like in practice? Drift after a model or prompt changes. When I swap in a new model version, and suddenly the agent, starts to interpret ambiguous results, requests a little bit differently, that's something I want to look at. I'm looking at silent regressions. The answers might look fine, but underneath it, what's changed? What wrong tool selection happened in a multi-step workflow? Did the agent pick the wrong tool early? Did it skip it? Like what actually happened to make this turn into a bad decision? And one of the things that is my personal favorite, a polished, confident final answer that completely masks the fact that an intermediate reasoning was complete nonsense. And here's what feels especially relevant in 2026. Prompt version changes are one of the biggest sources of silent behavior. And honestly, it's not just the prompt changes, but it's the ones that you don't even know about. System prompts that exist over system prompts. And so how do I create policy and guardrails that can maintain and detect some of these changes? What I'm going to introduce a little bit later is this concept of evals that you may have heard about. And that's going to give you the visibility into what agents are actually doing and not just what it says. But let's take a step back and just define some of the principles of AgentOps. At its core, it's really just four things. I'm going to observe, evaluate, gate, and control agents that I build. On the observe side, this is actually telling me what's happened. This is the play-by-play, like the actual full play-by-play of the agent. I'm looking at traces. I'm looking exactly what inputs came in, what outputs were put out, which tools got called. I'm measuring things like latency and token consumption. But when I move to evaluate, this tells me whether what happened was actually a good thing. And here I use things like golden prompts and evaluation data sets. I use scoring strategies and regression checks. And this is where I'm going to start to code into my application what the expectations are. And then I have the gate. This decides whether an agent's ready to ship to production or not. Did it pass all the quality thresholds that I set up? Did it regress in any of the critical test cases that I set up as part of my gate? And if it did, and I can state that those things happened, did I not deploy this or did I let it fall through the CI/CD gap and start failing production? The last concept that I have is talking about control modes and approval modes and tool permissions. I have to have the ability to disable some specific functionality or capability, or even better, just stop the whole agent when it starts to behave in a way that's unexpected. And so those four things kind of create this central loop around an agent lifecycle. And that's what this loop is meant to do, is to build the trust to get you over that trust gap. So a lot of my conversations are focused around the Microsoft sphere, but I will tell you that this is all across the multiple platforms. This is what people are talking about. In fact, the demos that I do when I do this live are using OpenTelemetry, and that's open source framework that anybody can be using. Foundry uses it, the agent framework uses it natively, and so are all the other ecosystems that you might be developing in it. So while I'm going to talk more intelligently about the Azure ecosystem, these concepts absolutely apply no matter where you're building and deploying your agents. So let's talk about what's happening when a user asks, a question of an agent and the workflow that it goes through. An agent run isn't really just a single model call. It's actually a small workflow that's wearing like some sort of a chatbot costume, right? A user sends input and an orchestration layer decides what to do with it, maybe does some planning, maybe breaking the request into some smaller subtasks, makes additional model calls. That model might decide that it needs to access a tool, search some docs, query a database. Maybe it pulls, memory out of a vector search or other memory, and it synthesizes everything into a final answer. And this is what keeps people up at night. Maybe that answer triggers some sort of a downstream action. Could be sending an email, updating a record, routing a ticket, and, in kind of the worst case scenario, deleting a production environment. So every one of those steps, if you look, on the screen, you get that red kind of lightning bolt. That's a failure point. And if you're only evaluating at the final answer, you're completely flying blind in the middle. What we want to make sure is that we're measuring each one of those steps. And that's why traces matter. And that's why evals are needed to check more than just did the output get where it needed to go. I'm going to switch over here to the Q&A. My favorite agent evaluation frameworks. So there's a great eval framework. Reach out to me, Kyle, afterwards, and I can share some of it. But that's native inside of the agent framework. Microsoft has had some really great updates on that. So, all right, getting back to the next slide. let's take a look at the AgentOps stacks. So we've got a bunch of different tools that we can use in AgentOps. I mentioned a couple of them, right out of the gate. Microsoft Agent Framework, not entirely new. This is kind of a synthesis between a couple of different tools. So we've got like semantic kernel, we've got AutoGen, and we brought that together into more cohesive agent framework. I mentioned already that I'm using OpenTelemetry, for a lot of my projects, and that's going to map into, App Insights, and there's new blades in Azure that allow you to like really dive deep into it. So we've also got like some really great features. This last time I did this talk down in Chicago, I walked through AI Foundry, how we could use we can automatically generate golden prompts. We can automatically generate tests. We've got the ability to look at the telemetry right inside of Azure Foundry. And then I can hook all that up into my GitHub Actions so that I get safe deployment through Azure DevOps or my GitHub Actions. These are kind of the things that we're using on a regular basis. And a lot of it, as you can see at the stickers, is new stuff that's coming out in 2026. Specifically, I want to dive a little bit deeper into the Microsoft Foundry. Half of what we're talking about for this time is stuff that got real in the last 6 months. And so let's just take a little bit of time to calibrate on some of that. The big one right here is in the middle. And this is, a month ago, April 3rd this year, Agent Framework hit general release. It's now production ready, and it's available for .NET and Python, all in kind of a single SDK. And they have, with it being in GA now, it's got the long-term support commitment from day one. If you've been waiting to build things on semantic kernel and AutoGen, I've been talking about these things in some of my other talks and webinars. You don't have to decide now, this is which one should I be using? The right framework to be using is the agent framework. And around that, the platform has been pretty busy as well. So December was kind of foundation laying. Foundry MCP servers, were in preview. The OpenTelemetry, GenAI semantic conventions were starting to become standardized. March is when tracing went to general availability. And I think that's the one that's going to matter a little bit the most, I would say, for what we're talking about today is the telemetry aspect of it. April, we had some new guardrails in preview, task adherence and prompt optimizations. I would, take a look at both of them. They're worth it. And then we're looking at 3 or 4 days ago, Agent 365 hit general availability. So Agent 365, I've done a lot of reading about it, haven't been able to do a lot of experimenting with it. But that's the M365 layer that the governance story for organizations is really going to hit. It's going to cause some changes in some of the licensing models and usage stuff, but those are some of the hot topics from the last couple of weeks. We're almost ready to get into the meat of this, but before I do, I want to give you somewhat of a lay of the land, what's happening in 2026 and what people are talking about. And this is the stuff that's actually starting to stick, and I'm seeing the team start to build pretty consistently with. First, I mentioned it, the OpenTelemetry is becoming the plumbing. Agent Framework now explicitly integrates with it, and OpenAI has been pushing teams towards using it as well. So if you're building something in a pro code environment, I would say just start using the OpenTelemetry framework. It's what everybody's going to be using. The portability that you're going to get out of it, it's going to thank you later. Second, I've been using trace-driven evals. So what I'm talking about is moving past the question of does the final answer look good, and to did the agent actually make good decisions at every step along the way? And industry right now is kind of converging on evaluating workflows with this trace level detail and not looking at just the final answers. Did I actually call the steps? Production traces, what I'm talking about with the production traces and the eval data sets is that your best test cases really come from the production scars. If you think back to that Friday night deployment problem, what did I do to make sure that didn't happen again? We're going to come back to this a little bit when we talk about feedback loops, but your best test cases are absolutely going to come from things that failed in production. Versioning. So I've got some things that I want to talk about around what do you want to capture when things are versioned, or what What are some things that get versioned? Prompts, tools, internal policies. This is one that I really leaned into this talk because if you can't really diff it, at this point, your CI/CD stuff's not going to be able to pick up on it and you can't really debug it. The last one is like making sure that we've got the CI/CD quality gates combined with everything that we're doing here. And so we can start to detect, my demos show how we can detect that in a CI/CD gate. So check out one of my live versions of this and we can walk through some of the demos. But you'll see how this actually gets picked up in the CI/CD gate when I have a build failure. I mentioned evals, and I'm not sure that everybody understands what an eval is. So I've got this slide to talk about what are the components that go into it. At a high level, it's like the unit test for probabilistics, problems like generative AI. And every eval, in my opinion, needs to have at least these 6 core points. First, what is the scenario and the situation that we're testing for? What's the real world setup that actually goes into making this a meaningful eval? Next would be the input. This could be the prompts, it could be the context or the tool state, and what are the conditions that happened around that run. And I would say it's not just the input from the standpoint of what the questions somebody typed in, but if I'm making tool calls, like I need to collect those inputs to those tool calls as well. What is the expected behavior? And this is really the critical one. It's not just what's the right answer. It's which tool should be called, how should it have been escalated, should this have been a refused request, and what shape did the output was it supposed to take? Is it a question? Is it JSON? Is it a recommendation versus a classification? These are all different ways that you need to think about that expected behavior. I talk about this assertion type pretty regularly, and there's a lot of different ways that I'm going to judge whether the answer was good or not good. That might be rules-based. It might be some sort of a semantic similarity. I could be using another LLM to judge it. And finally, let's not discount the fact that some of these just need to have a human that's going to be reviewing this at some point. So different scenarios are going to have different scoring methods. And that leads you to what is the measuring part? What is the pass threshold? Is this a hard 100% rule? Is it a pass fail? Is there a max latency that I need to have in there or some sort of cost constraint that I want to measure against? What's the similarity score supposed to be? How close to, especially when I'm, using RAG, that comes into play. And then finally, what's the impact to the business? What is the risk level that I need to account for? Because not all test cases are really going to be equal. I need to have some sort of a judgment aspect to that. If I route this to the wrong place, kind of annoying, but that's going to get it routed back to the right queue. But if I mishandle a safety kind of scenario, I could have data gets leaked out of my data estate, and that could be catastrophic for the organization. So, I'll just repeat this because a good eval has all these. A great eval is one that's based on a real production failure. So every time that something happens that causes us to come back to the developers, a support ticket, ask yourself, is this an opportunity for me to build an eval around this that I can use to capture the results? So we've talked about what good ones, what evals are and what the good ones are. But here's the thing. None of this can happen if you can't actually answer one basic question. What changed between the version that you're working on today and the one that you had deployed yesterday? So this is the versioning slide that I was talking about before, and it's something that most teams haven't really thought about yet. I want you to not skip this so you don't regret it later. Ask yourself what needs to be versioned. For me, obviously, the first one that we're gonna use is what's the model version that we deployed, and I want to it's not just the model number, because the same family model today is not necessarily the same family model that was 2 months ago. 4.0 or 4.0 mini isn't last month's 4.0 mini. And the reason behind that is because the providers have their own system prompts that sit under the hood, and those changed. And you can detect those changes, but you have to look for them and understand it so that you're pinning and tracking those, as you go along. We also want to track the system prompts, right? Prompts and instructions. This is the number one source of behavioral changes. I actually had this one customer that we built an agent for them. It was a chatbot that they were using. And as they were like making, tweaks to like the process or the things like they were testing with it, they're like, hey, can you give me the ability to like just go and edit the system prompts so I don't have to call you every time? And I'm like, absolutely not. That's a terrible idea. Because if you change the word and to or if you change it from the to and, like just little tiny like contextual changes, you're changing that prompt. And I need to have an understanding of what it was, what changed at that point in time. And then tool contracts. So we're using MCP quite a bit. I mean, I'm sure that a lot of people that are building agents are using MCP all over the place. Those are tools, and those tools have contracts. So when those contracts change, you need to understand, that's something that's going to change the behavior as well. What evaluator version are you using? I mentioned one of these possibilities before, which is using LLMs to actually judge and score your evals. Real common practice, and you'll see in some of my demos in Azure Foundry that when you run these evals, you actually select the model for the evaluation. That's going to be a source of the change of behaviors on the eval aspect of it. So make sure that you're tracking that as well. Policies and guardrails. So internally or otherwise, there might be compliance changes or content policy that changes. Maybe there's a safety classifier on some sort of like purview classification that or labeling that's happening. These are all things that like you might not have thought about that you can actually grab and trace and version some of these pieces of information as well. Indexing, embeddings. I know this is like something that might be a little bit foreign to some people if they don't work with RAG a lot. But at the end of the day, I've got a really good story about this one. We've got this manufacturing customer that has these consumer goods, and they have like three main personas of people that would actually look at installation manuals or user guides. The end consumer, obviously, they're one aspect of it. Maybe contractors or suppliers or another, or maybe architects is another, type of persona. And we started with just like one aspect. We started with the contractors. They're the ones that we care about the most. If we get it wrong, they're the ones that are going to notice. So we wanted to start with that group of documents. But as we started to layer in the consumer grade documents into our RAG pipelines, the behavior started to change. And once we started to look at it, it was because the information in there was inconsistent. So versioning the data that you're feeding into your vector indexes is also as important as the system prompt, because it's going to change the outputs very dramatically when you start having conflicting data. The agent doesn't know which one is the most important or the right one, and you have to like learn how to adjust your prompts accordingly. So we built our evals, we versioned things. And now, we also have demonstrated that we can trace the decisions that we're making inside of our agents. What's the next question? How do we actually get this thing in front of real users without losing sleep? The answer is that you're going to climb through certain steps. And most of the teams that I work with have like two modes: demo and production. That's it. They go from A to Z, instantly, and they have nothing in between. This slide is really about how you build the things in between. I would start with like a dev and local testing. Like, hey, it works in my machine. That's great. Congratulations. That was the easy part. But let's start moving this into like an offline eval gate. Can you run the data, the golden data sets? Does the agent pass? Like if it doesn't, we're not going to go up to the next step. But that next step is a shadow mode, and it's one that I like a lot. This is one that most teams have been skipping and they haven't really thought about it, and it can save you a lot of time and effort. If you have an agent that's running alongside your production system, it's seeing the inputs, it's generating real output prompts someplace, not to the user yet, but it gives you the ability to evaluate the real production scenarios. So nothing's actually getting executed. You're just watching all the instruments before you hand over the wheel to an agent. But when you're ready to hand over that wheel, then you move into a canary mode. So maybe what I'm doing is just taking a small subset of that traffic, 1 out of every 20. I'm going to route to the agent, have it perform as if it was running autonomously. And I can like look at the traffic signals. If it does make a mistake, the blast radius of those mistakes is really small, and I have a much easier time like controlling that rollback. But if I've done that canary test, things are working really well. Maybe as part of my canary test, I've got a human review mode that's still there. But I definitely, the first iteration of an agent that we deploy here at Concurrency typically has a human in the loop mode first. And human improves every single one of the actions before we actually pass that off to a tool for automation. And it's expensive still, right? We've built all this automation. We've got all the things checked, but I'm still having the person do the work. Why? It's how we get past that trust gap. It's how we build confidence. We demonstrate to the users that it's doing exactly what they would have done if they were in that situation. Then I can scope out a production deployment. What specific use cases, what specific user groups do I want to roll this out to? Not the full broad production, but where can I push this out where it's going to have, where I want to be able to measure and expand that envelope gradually. Once I have that confidence, I can route it to the full traffic. I can have full autonomy, but I have to have monitoring along, built in at this point in time, because at some point in time, something's going to change and it's going to start like misbehaving. We have all seen this before. That's where I want to make sure that we really have that end-to-end definition. What is my rollback trigger? How do I know when and what to roll back? What score drops that trigger? What error rate? What safety flag? Get an agreement on that before you actually get to this point, because Friday at 5:30 when everything's blown up is not the right time to be having a meeting about what qualifies enough to roll it back. The other thing that I wanted to call out is that every stage in this ladder is a point for you to be able to roll back to the beginning or just back to one more step back. Have that built out as a strategy before you start climbing so that you're not just hoping along the way that it's going to all work out. I want to talk about this intervention ladder as well. Ladders are great analogies, but let's say that things start to fail in production. How are we going to figure out what we're going to do and how we're going to control and restrain an agent? And this applies in a lot of scenarios. So here's the way that I kind of look at it. First, level one, something's looking weird. I've got some non-critical evals that are alerting me that something's amiss. I'm getting notifications. The agent keeps running, and I'm going to start keeping an eye on it. But at some point in time, I've noticed a little clustering pattern of some of the problems, and I might want to go into just a review mode. So what I'm doing is I'm saying that the agent can still make recommendations, but at this point in time, I've escalated it to a human to approve any of the actions before it executes. Not asking for the human to make the decisions, just saying, hey, do you approve this or not approve? This is great for customer communications or financial transactions, things that could be kind of sensitive. You want to review, to have a human review. Next level up might be I've noticed that it's having these specific problems. Maybe the agent can still answer some of the questions automatically and give some of the feedback to the user. But what I don't want it to do is I don't want it to write that record to my ERP system. I don't want to close out that invoice. I don't want to process this payment. I'm going to hold back on the tool calls. And so that's the restricted mode. I'm just disabling specific capabilities. Level 4 is disabling the capability entirely. I might be turning off a specific agent or maybe just a specific sub-agent within that agent workflow because that's what's causing the problem. And I want to do a root cause analysis. And finally, make sure you have a nuclear option, full shutdown, stop the agent, revoke access. Right now, the tools that are coming out are allowing you to do this much more effectively. In Foundry, for example, the control plane actually gives you a centralized lifecycle to be able to see what agents you have in inventory. You can monitor their health. You can perform actions all from that control plane. There's other ways that you can do this inside of Microsoft's Agent 365. You started to assign an actual identity to the agent so you can revoke access just like you would letting an employee go and terminating their access. But the key is you need to have all of these controls designed and thought through before you start deploying your agent into production and before you actually need to use them. Kind of getting to the end here a little bit. If you have any other questions, feel free to drop some of them in the chat. What are some of the things you actually want to watch when your agent goes live? I would say if your only metric is, did you get the right answer? You're really bringing a pool noodle to the Marlin fight. So what do I actually mean? Latency. How long is this agent taking? Are the tool calls slow? Are the models slow? Are you hitting the rate limits? What's happening underneath the scenes? And having latency isn't necessarily bad. One of the examples that I can give is we're having some challenges with how well the agent was reasoning through, the various amounts of data that it had access to. And so we changed from GPT 5.3 to 5.4. And instead of like latency being like 7 to 8 seconds, it started turning into like 20, 30 seconds, really disrupted like the user experience. But we were also measuring things like how was the evaluator like scoring this? And we saw a really huge uptick. So we rolled back temporarily, but we noticed that those evaluator averages went back down, and we made the conscious decision to go back into the 5.4 model because the trade-off was actually worth it. We got better answers. We just fixed like what the user saw from a feedback mechanism so that they didn't feel like they were waiting forever, and we got the right output. What about quality scores? We talked about that. Safety flags. That's a big one to make sure that you're putting some of these things in place. But not all of these are going to apply to you and your organization. But what I would do is like pick 3 or 4 of these that matter and start watching them, not like boil the ocean and say, I'm going to capture everything and build a dashboard that has, 100 different metrics that I have to score. So bringing this home, what are you going to do tomorrow or later today if you're really ambitious? I would say, here's your starter kit. Think about this as just like a pre-departure checklist. First one, add tracing. Go back, implement open telemetry if you can. It doesn't have to be fancy. Just wire up the harness and start capturing something. That's going to give you a little bit of a flavor of how to apply this into your projects going forward. Capture the tool calls specifically looking at inputs and outputs. Every parameter that you can, start to incorporate that into your evals. And then I would define, somewhere around 5 to 10, golden prompts and expected behaviors. Don't boil the ocean. Don't say I'm going to implement 100 different evals. You're going to get stuck. And definitely don't say, well, we're just going to start with one. Go back to your product team. Ask them what are 5 to 10 like critical things that you need, critical test cases, and use that as your baseline moving forward. And add just one regression check to your CI/CD pipeline. Make sure that you have something tight that if it fails, the build's going to fail. Demonstrate that you can actually stop it going into production and prove that that pattern is working first. Step 5, I would choose one risky action that requires some sort of a human review. Maybe that is sending an email. Maybe it's sending an update on the sales order. Maybe it's sending an invoice out. Whatever scares you the most, put a human in the loop for that at first. And then definitely define that kill switch playbook that I talked about. Document how you're going to move the agent into a review mode, how you want to disable it, and who has the authority to do it. Don't wait until things have started to fail until you have that mapped out. That needs to start at the beginning. And then finally, monitor the costs. Agents, and this is, I have a lot more to say about this later, not today, but like in some of my like newsletter posts. The economics is changing. I'm noticing some of the tools that I use on a regular basis have completely changed their token consumption, their cost models. Everybody's going to start doing it. The end of subsidized AI is over, and we're going to all start using consumption as the metric, and it's going to get expensive fast. And that includes these models that are being hosted as well. So start putting in the token consumption, start measuring some of the costs. This stuff can get out of hand really, really quick. And so these are basically my steps to success. And with that, I will say, if there's any questions, drop them in the chat. I'll stay on here for a little bit. Follow me on LinkedIn, follow Concurrency, and Amy's dropped a little bit of a form in here as well. Fill that out. Give me some feedback. Did this resonate with you and your team? Did you want to set up 20 minutes to meet with me? Fill out that form, or if you connect with me on LinkedIn, I'm happy to meet with you. So that being said, thanks for joining me today.